Tashlakachukma, Holchifoat Ihuitana, Chikashasaya, Chatasaya, Gabrielino Tonga, Oglako Yagnimako, Pisahan Shibika Natoka, Hachimanolili. Hello, everyone. I greeted you and welcomed you to today's event in the Chickasaw language. My name is Shannon and I'm Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent and a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. I am a faculty member in gender studies and anthropology, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. I acknowledge the Gabrielino Tonga peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, which encompasses much of what is currently called Los Angeles, as well as the South Channel Islands, and upon which the American Indian Studies Center and UCLA reside. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukritam ancestors, Ahihiram elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. I want to ask all of us to take a moment of silence in honor of the passing of Julia Bogany, Tongva elder, Gabrielino Tongva elder, who was a close friend and collaborator of the center. She joined the ancestors last Sunday. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this special event with our honored guests, Amanda Blackhorse and Suzan Shown Harjo, who I will introduce in just a moment after turning it over briefly to our AISC Programs Coordinator, Pamela Peters.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pamela J. Peters. I'm the Operations and Event Coordinator of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. As a Dene woman living here on Tovangar, otherwise known as Los Angeles, I too would like to pay my respects to the Tongva people. I feel it's important to acknowledge our tribal relatives' homeland and also to learn about the homeland and the community you reside on. As for me, I understand I'm a visitor here as my homeland is the Navajo Nation. And now I would like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's talk about removal of American Indian mascots and the continuing fight for Native American rights, with two amazing women activists that I admire very much, Amanda Blackhorse and Suzan Shown Harjo. This afternoon's talk will be moderated by the UCLA American Indian Studies Center Director, Shannon Speed. Shannon will ask a series of questions to both Amanda and Suzanne. Thereafter, we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions that can be shared in the chat box. If you can, please include your name followed with your question in the chat box, as all questions will be directed to me. And please be respectful and enjoy this afternoon's talk. Thank you.
And I will now introduce our two guests before moving to questions. So Amanda Blackhorse is Dene and a member of the Navajo Nation. She is a licensed clinical social worker from Big Mountain in Cheyenne, Arizona. In 2014, Amanda and 4 other young Native American petitioners, organized by Suzan Shown Harjo and represented by Drinker Biddle and Reed, won their 9-year-long case before the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board under the U.S. Patent Office in Blackhorse et al. Versus Pro Football. The petition aimed to cancel the federal registrations of the NFL team, the Washington Red Word that we're not using. These registrations included the team's name and logo. This unprecedented victory appeared to end an over 40-year battle against the R word, but over the next several years, Pro Football appealed and sued. Somehow my screen, is somebody sharing their screen? My screen has disappeared.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Okay, it's back. Thank you. This unprecedented victory appeared to end an over 40-year battle against the R word, but over the next several years, Pro Football appealed and sued the Blackhorse group in federal court. Unfortunately, in early 2018, the Blackhorse case came to a close when the US Supreme Court struck down Section 2A from the Lanham Act in a separate intellectual property case, Model versus Tam. Amanda is a founder of a Phoenix-based group named Arizona to Rally Native American Mascots, which works to spread awareness in Arizona about the harmful effects of Native American mascots and Native cultural appropriation. As an advocate against Native American mascots, Amanda speaks nationally about how colonization and historical trauma contribute to the legacy of Native American mascots. Suzan Shown Harjo, Cheyenne and Hodulgee Muscogee, is a writer, curator, and policy advocate who has developed landmark laws and led myriad campaigns for Native and Indigenous people's rights. She's helped Native Americans to protect cultural, historic, and sacred places and to recover 1 million acres of land. President of the Morningstar Institute and former executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, she is also a poet, playwright, and award-winning columnist for Indian Country Today. Leader of many campaigns to end Indian stereotyping, mascotting, and appropriating at the educational and professional sports levels. She's best known for her tireless work to eliminate the vile name and logo of the Washington football team, which announced it would end its identification in July 2020. Elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020, she's a founding member of its new Standing Committee on Anti-Racism. In awarding her a 2014 Presidential Medal of Freedom, the United States' highest civilian honor, President Barack Obama said that she has, quote, fought all her life for human, civil, and treaty rights of Native peoples. Her tireless efforts have protected Native culture, returned Native lands, and improved Native lives. With bold resolve, Suzan Shown Harjo pushes us to always seek justice in our time, end quote. A founding trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian, she began coalition work in 1967 that led to the NMAI Establishing Act, repatriation laws, and nationwide museum reform. It took more than 20 years to achieve. She wrote about that journey in It Began with a Vision in a Sacred Place. The Institute of American Indian Arts and the NMAI honored her with a 2019 symposium where 14 writers presented papers that are being published in A Promise Kept, the inspiring life and works of Suzan Shown Harjo. The curator of the Smithsonian Institution NMAI exhibit. She is also the editor of the book that accompanied the exhibition, both titled Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations. An annual award, the Suzan Shown Harjo Activist for Systemic Social Justice Award, was named in tribute to her by NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education. She has a number of firsts under her belt, including being the first person to receive back-to-back residencies at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, first to receive 2 Sovereignty Symposium medals, the first woman awarded IAIA's Honorary Doctorate of Humanities, the first Native American woman Montgomery Fellow, and the first Vine Deloria Junior Distinguished Indigenous Scholar. Please join me in welcoming our 2 accomplished and distinguished guests.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. I'm just thrilled to be here with you and to learn from you. So as your bios indicate, you've both been working on getting the Washington football team and many other teams to eliminate stereotyped names and images for quite some time. Can you share what steered your passion to start this work and how has it changed over the years?
I'll start off. All my relatives, most of my relatives, couldn't stand the mascot for the University of Oklahoma, named Little Red. And it was a dancing white guy, everyone called the dancing idiot. And he would come out and do fake Indian dancing, and he had a fake Native costume. He didn't have real regalia or anything. And it was always a different boy each year. And while they thought it was a great honor for themselves, most of us thought it was just tacky to disgusting. When I was in my senior year in high school, a very important man came to visit us. He was an older man. He was in his 20s. And that was Clyde Warrior, who was a Ponca man who started the Oklahoma Indian Youth Council, who started the National Indian Youth Council. He was what we really knew him best as was a fancy dancer on the powwow circuit. And he was very famous for that, an award-winning dancer. And he was an orator. He was a wonderful orator. So he energized me. He energized and informed me about this issue. I had never heard anyone articulate it as an issue. I, I had just listened to those of us who were complaining, and we knew what our complaints were. We knew what we didn't like, but we didn't know what we didn't know. So he taught me a lot. And later, I also met Della Warrior, who was his wife, and she's still a friend. Clyde, was, in addition to starting NIYC in Oklahoma, um, he was informing us about student rights, voting rights, but he was saying this is a foundational issue. This is so important. We have to get rid of this because it helps people hide behind their racism by presenting something that they think is not offensive and kind of cute, that's cartoony. And we have to disabuse them of that. So that's what really energized me. And he would say, and his target was Little Red. We have to get rid of Little Red. And he died very young. He died a couple of years before the campaign was successful, but Della and Native students at the University of Oklahoma and a cross section of students of color and women and any way you segment society, everyone was on the Native side to get rid of Little Red. So that was a very successful effort that he didn't live to see, but it's his legacy, really. And what he used to say about Washington was, because he was coordinating across the country with on campuses and working with Stanford and Dartmouth and Syracuse and St. John's and Marquette and all the others that would come along later. And it was kind of a race to see who would be first. Well, OU was first to retire Little Red. And what Clyde would say about Washington was the worst one is the one right in the heart of the capital of the United States, which sounded to me like it was underneath the Capitol dome. And that is the Washington R word. And only at that time, we went ahead and said it, even though we didn't like the word. We knew it was something despicable. We knew it was horrendous in our background, but people acted like they didn't even know what we were talking about if we tried to use euphemisms. And so when years later, when I finally moved to Washington, D.C., I really saw how oppressive, mightily oppressive, this team name and image and their behavior were to the people who lived in and around Washington, D.C., and importantly, how much they influenced all of the people we depended on to make policies better for us. So that's my entree into the world of the No Mascot movement, and I'm proud to say I've been part of it since 1962.
I'm doing it again, talking with my mute on. Thanks so much. That's terrific. We're glad you've been a part of it and such a powerful part of it. Can you share with the public what year Little Red was eliminated?
1970. Finally eliminated in 1970. It did take a sit-in, something that sounds so antiquated now, but a demonstration where people just sat down and didn't move. And that was the National Indian Youth Council, Clyde Warrior's old organization, that did that in and around the chancellor's office. So the chancellor of the University of Oklahoma couldn't go to work. And he reviewed the record where every committee had said, get rid of the thing. And he finally took it up, and it was eliminated in 1970. And that was the very first one in American sports to be eliminated from educational sports or professional sports. And it would be 2 years before the next one, and then 2 more years before the next one. And those were Stanford and Dartmouth. And then four, and on and on and on, until I should say that before people get depressed about little progress, we've made so much progress. Uh, we have eliminated more than 2,000 of these offenses in American sports since 1970. And while there are about, maybe half of the, there may be half to go. I think not. I think we've eliminated most of them, but there are still some left to go. Nonetheless, if this were a game, we would be on the downhill slide. We are winning. We have always won. And we look forward to everyone's help to get rid of every last one of them in the country.
Thanks, Suzanne. What about you, Amanda? How did you come to this work?
Hi, Yate. So I came into this work around about 2005-ish. And I really I didn't have a lot of knowledge about this prior to that. But I think it's one of those situations where you have to see it to really understand it. And so, you know, back then, 2005, I was in college, and I was kind of going through this sort of transformation and sort of a decolonization process in college. And I was attending Haskell Indian Nations University, and then went to the University of Kansas, and was around, really influenced by a lot of other Indigenous scholars, and some really awesome professors, who really kind of woke me up to a lot of Native issues. I had never really studied that or been taught that in school. And so I got involved with a group, and we started a group called Not on Our Honor. And it was around the time, this is when the NCAA was going through their change, and making schools, universities throughout the nation stop using Native mascots unless they got approval from a local tribe. So at the time, the University of Illinois was going through this transformation, and they were supposed to play KU, the school that I was attending, and KU refused to play that team because they were refusing to change their name. And so it was this huge thing at the University of Kansas. And so that's kind of where I got to learn more about the issue. And it was also the same year that the Washington team was supposed to play in Kansas City. And, we know the name of the Kansas City team. And so at that time, it was just this big deal. I couldn't believe how much of a big deal it was in Kansas City. People are like, this is the first time, the R word and the Chiefs are supposed to play. And it was like Native against Native. And that was just in itself was such a big deal to the fans. And so going there, I wasn't really sure what to expect. But going there, I just could not believe the way that people reacted to us when we were peacefully protesting, and the way that the fans felt like it was okay to the way that they talked to us, the things that they said to us, the hurtful things that they said to us, the racist things, the violent things. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Like, in this day and age, how is this okay? I mean, I knew racism existed. I've experienced racism, but a lot of the times it's, really done quietly, or, or at least that's how I was taught to deal with racism, was just, be quiet, don't cause a fuss, just keep moving, and, you know, just deal with it, basically. And I just couldn't believe it. And so at that point, I got to know Rhonda Lavaldo, and she was the one who actually brought our group together, not in her honor. And so she knew Suzan, and Suzan was looking for some young Native people who were active in that area, to bring about another lawsuit. So the lawsuit I was a part of was the second part of Suzan's case. So that's how I got involved, and ever since then, it's just been something that I was kind of pulled into it, but I can't put it down, because I feel like the way people treat us, if we allow that to be okay and socially acceptable, for people to demean us and call us drunks and tell us to go back to our reservation, and say really crazy things to us, our kids are going to eventually grow up, and they're going to be walking around, and they're going to be subjected to these things as well. If they want to go to a football game, if they want to engage in sports, if they want to, be as, just live in this country, they're going to be called these things. And so we have to do something about it. And so I think I just also wanted to say something about what Suzan said. She mentioned, bringing this up at a time when no one was talking about this. This was a time when it was very, I can't imagine how scary it was to have to talk about this in a time when it's, people are just starting to learn and hear about this, especially also living in DC, where the name of the Washington team, people are holding on to it for decades and decades. It's like, it's very daunting task, but here we are, having a conversation about this team that has now changed their name. So I just want to say hats off to Suzan, and all the work that she has done in this area. We wouldn't be here talking about this and having this conversation if it weren't for the work that she has done.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Amanda. You mentioned the case that Blackhorse et al. Versus Pro Football, right? That resulted in a 2014 victory, but that got set back. Well, it also triggered you being sued, right? And was later kind of gutted in a decision in a separate case. Do either of you want to talk a little bit about that case specifically, and particularly like what its impacts might have been despite the setbacks?
Well, the big impact was the day we announced the lawsuit, Harjo et al. Versus Pro Football Inc. On September 10th, 1992. It was a huge blow to all the people who love that name and swore that they were honoring us, and that they weren't doing anything wrong, and they couldn't figure out why people were suing them and how that could possibly be. And the Washington owners were letting out the word that it was a frivolous lawsuit. Well, we ended up being in court 17 years, so how frivolous could it have been? Lawsuits that lack merit don't stay in court very long, and ours did. So it was the first time that anyone had ever tried to cancel trademark licenses, trademark registrations. And not only did we try, we got 3 judges to agree with us in 1999 after 7 years of litigation and one hearing before the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board, we won a unanimous decision from 3 trademark experts, trademark judges, and that really was history making. That had never happened before. So it was a landmark decision and a landmark suit, and we were on our way. And then we hit the federal district court. I'm sure an otherwise smart and wonderful person, but the judge was someone who couldn't tell the team propaganda from real history or law, and began her decision with just regurgitating team propaganda that said one of the ways you can tell that they're really honoring Native Americans is they named the team after what they said was, and I hate these terms, a full-blooded Sioux from South Dakota who was a beloved coach, Lone Star Dietz, William Lone Star Dietz. Well, unbeknownst to me, because I believed their propaganda, I didn't think they'd lie about something as close to them as a beloved coach, which, by the way, he was a coach for 11 months. So I don't know how beloved you can be with in 11 months, but be that as it may, he was not exactly a full blood, not exactly Sioux. He was, in fact, a white man from Wisconsin whose parents were German American on both sides. And his genealogy takes him all the way to Northern Europe, ancestor before ancestor before ancestor. Never been to South Dakota. In fact, the more we looked into it, and through the good work of Linda Wagoner, who unearthed a lot of records, we did additional research and found that he had been investigated by the FBI. There had been a trial against him. He tried to get out of doing his service to the country, tried to get out of the draft by saying he was a non-citizen Indian. He also tried to gain the land of an actual person named James One Star, who was a student and who had died in connection with Carlisle, the first Indian boarding school. And that's not how he died. They had sort of transferred him over to the Army, and he fought in a war that the United States wasn't even supposed to be in, a secret war, on the side of Cuba in their war of independence against Spain. And he died. And the powers that be, who had brought this William Dietz in as a football playing ringer, gave him that identity of James One Star, and he ran with it and even wrote, and they told him apparently that this was a secret even from his own people. So he was writing to the actual sister of James One Star, until the court case against him. And she was brought in as a witness, and she said, "Why are you writing to me as my brother? You're not my brother." Okay, so this is part of the sordid history of the kind of people that the Washington football team has put up since its very beginnings as a Native person, as Native people. And it is no wonder that in all our 2 cases, combined litigation of 25 years, The Washington football team never brought a single Native person into court, subject to court scrutiny on their side. Not one. While all along they talked about us in very unpleasant terms and said we were in writing that our plaintiffs, myself and my co-plaintiffs, were a handful of militant Indians, and they characterized the National Congress of American Indians, the National Indian Youth Council, National Indian Education Association, and the Tulsa Indian Coalition Against Racism as our amici cohorts, which really sounds terrible. I don't mind being in a cohort with those amici, but they didn't mean it to sound good. So this is we were up against people who had played sleight of hand and played fast and loose with the truth about who they were, who had obscured their own identity while they were trying to ruin our good names and put this horrible historical era on the backs of our kids, and wouldn't even talk with us about changing it. And of course, fought tooth and nail in court to keep us from changing it, and just to make sure, and mounted a huge PR campaign. So with the entire NFL participating, by the way, and they weren't even a party to the suit, but they paid for all of it, at least up to the 7th year that we know of for sure. One Washington Post reporter, Mike Wise at the time, had confirmed that they had paid for every bit of the litigation, but we knew for sure that they had paid for 7 years, the first 7 years of the case. So this is the kind of thing. Now the federal district judge just gave us, as if it were the law, this propaganda about beloved Coach and Sue and South Dakota and everything, a complete fabrication that's made to seem as if we were dolts who just didn't understand history and historical inevitability and when we were being treated well.
Fascinating. That's I just learned a lot about that lawsuit and what was involved in the context, and it's all really fascinating. Amanda, I don't know if you want to add anything, or maybe about the second part of the lawsuit that you were involved in.
Yeah, I think later on, I don't remember what year it was. Suzanne, you probably know. It was 2000, maybe 13 or so. My lawyer, Jesse, went and found, and I'm sure you were also behind this too, Suzanne, a little small snippet in an old newspaper called the Hartford Courant, where the owner at the time said, we did not name the team because, I guess it was popular opinion. Everyone was saying, oh, they named the team because of William Lone Star Dietz. And he said, we did not name the team because of Lone Star Dietz. They were trying to separate it because they didn't want people to think that he was responsible, I guess. And so this little snippet, that was kind of buried away all of these years was kind of brought forth, and it's like, okay, you guys are still claiming that William Lone Star Dietz is the reason why you have this name, and now that's been debunked. So, where do you go from here? And they've never responded to that. So they did a lot of that happen throughout the years, the flip-flopping and the targeting, of course, and the campaigns that they put together to make us seem like that we weren't Native or that we didn't have Native connections. You know, they created the Original Americans Foundation and threw millions of dollars into it in the first few years to give money to the quote unquote poor natives, and to make it seem like they were they were charitable and that they cared about Native people. And that really only started until after the 2014 win in the trademark, under the trademark board. And so, because that's when it kind of became, you know, came up again in the media. And, you know, they put all this money into that. They spent so much money trying to make us look bad. They went for, you know, my president of the Navajo Nation and got him in their box seats at a game. You know, I mean, the campaign that they put on was just ridiculous. They probably would have saved more money just changing the name than having to, you know, put all this millions of dollars into trying to make us look bad. But in the end, it all came out, you know. We now know that they did away with the Original Americans Foundation that they put together. They said they're no longer going to be, it's no longer a foundation now. The Native person that they hired to sort of head their Native campaigns within their organization, they let him go, so he's no longer there. So basically at this point, they have no Native connections at all, from what I've seen.
Yeah, thanks. You know, you guys raised a question earlier about this, you know, this argument that they make about, you know, Native names and mascots being honoring of Native peoples, right? And how they push that argument over and over again. And, you know, I recently read something about the Washington team, the owner, Dan Snyder, and the coach have talked about how they're going, because right now it's just being called the Washington football team, I think, and they're going to rebrand it. And they wanted, in that rebranding, do something that honors Native Americans, right? So they used that, they deployed that term again, and I'm assuming they didn't do it accidentally, right? That seems purposeful to me. And so I wonder if you two are concerned about how that rebranding effort is going to go.
Well, the people who supposedly saved the day and got rid of the term, the former name of the Washington football team, which we've been calling the Washington football team since we sued them in 1992. So I'm glad it finally caught on. And it looks good on their the Washington football team. That makes sense. But no. So the people who supposedly made this happen, the owner of FedEx and two other people who were the minority shareholders of the Washington franchise, have cashed out. They sold their 40%. So now Daniel Snyder is the sole owner, and he is itching to get back to some sort of subjugation of Native peoples. And he's in the past toyed with the idea of warriors, which would be fine if it were not with feathers and feather headdresses and Native symbols. If you have a neutral word or a word that is generic, then make it generic, or feel free to rag on someone else, but stop assigning it to Native peoples and stop making our children targets of all of this. So who knows what is going to happen. I hope that common sense prevails, but Daniel Snyder is known as a very stubborn person, and I would hope that he's learned something by taking on this new identity as the Washington football team, that the fans go where the team goes. I mean, the Utah Jazz didn't, people in Utah are still loving the Utah Jazz, and people in New Orleans didn't just stop loving basketball because it left and went west. These names come and go, these identities come and go, but it's the actual team that people are going to care about. So we even had bumper stickers made for people who didn't know that they could love the team and hate the name at the same time. And somehow you had to give them permission to think that, because they felt it was being disloyal, which is sort of at the crux of this. If you look at what's happening societally, it's that the things that make our children and grandchildren feel terrible and find insulting and put targets on their backs are the things that make non-native people's children and grandchildren feel great. And that has been proven time and again in several studies by Stephanie Freiberg, Dr. Freiberg, who's a Tulalip scientist, psychologist, and her studies demonstrate exactly that point. And many others. She's done extraordinary work in this field. And the idea that the Washington football team could just walk away from us, and the team and the fans would walk away from the new team is absurd. The fans are going to stick with the team no matter what. I hope that Daniel Snyder has had his own kind of epiphany in this time of reckoning, and that he has come to understand what many others have understood about ownership and how one group can demean another, and how that is not acceptable, whether it's a social demeaning, whether it's a physical demeaning, a cultural demeaning. Any of that kind of behavior is totally unacceptable, especially at this time. And I hope that Mr. Snyder has really understood that, and that it is a time to walk away from that kind of behavior. He might not understand why it's one of the last vestiges of white supremacy that is publicly permissible, but that it is, he should understand.
Absolutely. And I hope you're right about him having an epiphany. We'll see. Amanda, did you have thoughts on that question?
Well, really just, going back to sort of Dan Snyder, and I think that it's really interesting how he and a lot of other people also do this as well. They say, and they try to believe that what they are doing is the right thing. They stand behind, even though they get the backlash, even though, they have the opportunity to make things right. They kind of stand behind this idea of honoring, I'm honoring you. You should be proud, that we're actually talking about you. And I think, it was throughout the litigation, it was almost like, how dare you guys? How dare you guys even try to question us? Who are you? We're a $1 billion franchise, and you guys are just, Native people who, who don't mean anything to us really. It's our image, the stereotypical image that is more important to them. And so I think that's what I've kind of seen in this process, where it's, after a while, it kind of becomes this sort of egotistical, sort of hetero patriarchal sort of idea of, I am, a billionaire and you can't tell me what to do. And I'm just going to believe that I am actually honoring you guys, and I'm going to go with that. And that's how it's going to be, and I think that, after all these years, just sort of being silenced and being, like Suzanne said, they refuse to meet with Native people. They refuse to have that conversation, a very basic sort of conversation. That's what I kind of see. So, yeah, so that's all I wanted to bring up. Sorry.
That was great. Yeah, thanks so much. I want to draw a question from the audience now and kind of add to it because it relates to a question that I had. Suzanne mentioned earlier that thousands of these names have been eliminated. We are winning, and that's amazing, but there's still a ways to go, right? The struggle continues, and many names remain to be changed. And I was thinking here about like K-12, because there was legislation put forward last week by Native Representative Deb Lekanoff to eliminate all Native American names of mascots and schools in the state of Washington. And Rosetta Walker from the audience is also raising the fact that local teams on tribal lands and urban areas also have kind of Native mascots. She gives the example of the Tuba City Warriors and the Red Mesa R-Word, both on the Navajo Nation. But I spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. Those kinds of names are everywhere in Oklahoma as well, in Indian territory, Indian country. So we wonder what you all think about how these kinds of things can be eliminated moving into the future.
Well, it's no wonder that there's still a handful, and literally a handful, of the R-word schools in Indian country. That's classic internalized oppression. The BIA started this. The United States Army started it before there was a real BIA. And if you want to trace the beginnings of the popularization of Native peoples used as mascots, you have to go to the beginning of the federal Indian boarding school system, where they were trying to detribalize and deculturalize the children and keep them away from parents, grandparents, extended families, keep them away from language, keep them away from customs, keep them away from the land, all in an effort for them to detach. And then at the same time, they were hostage students kept in order to not just civilize them, be civilized, which meant Christian only, English only curriculum in school terms, but it meant that that the Army and the Christian institutions had a grip on the people, the little people in schools had a grip on the strong families at home. It was a control mechanism. So part of the detribalization was a pan-Indian approach that Captain Pratt at Carlisle, the first of the Indian boarding schools, really promoted. And that was, you submerge individual identity by calling everyone a group thing. So the Indians, the R-word, the Braves, the Warriors, the Chiefs, any of those names a broad thing. So it's not a particular Native nation, although interestingly enough, Pratt used my people, the Cheyenne people, as the prototype Plains Indian, which we're not, but that was his idea. And why? Because he served in the cavalry under Philip Sheridan. He's the one who spawned the phrase, the only good Indian's a dead one, under General George Armstrong Custer, Lieutenant Colonel. He was various ranks, who didn't win at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and before that, who massacred almost everyone at Washita, all the Cheyenne men, many of the women, and he and his men did a systematic rape of the women and young boys, and murder of all the ponies that were there. And people talk about how you could hear the ponies screaming at night. And I dare say probably not just the ponies. So he served with people who were fighting and trying to win the war against Plains Indians. So we became the prototype for all Indians, all Native peoples. And so it was a feathered headdress, and usually with no face, no head, just the headdress, and those names. And it went like crazy all across the country, and everyone picked up on it. That's still with us today. You have people who never, I mean, I'm also Muscogee at Muscogee Creek, and our people never had feathered headdresses like that. We had some feathers, but maybe one in a turban, and that's a very different kind of look. And yet the Muscogee kids would be forced into this stereotype of a Plains Indian. So this is all the stuff that has happened, and it is. I mean, I look at it as a victory that there are only about 5 of these residual schools with the R word name on reservations. All of them should be ashamed of themselves and turn it in and say we're not the clones of the worst of the Army. We're not the clones of the worst of the BIA. We are who we are. So that's sort of where it comes from, and why it's important to not look at where we also have failings in Indian country, but to look to how the rest of the country can be cleaned up. I mean, what are they doing with the R word in any place? Why are they doing that? And why are they calling teams Indians? And there is no dignity for Native peoples in being called anything that's for the recreation and the entertainment of others or of ourselves. That's not, if a school name is the Native nation's name or a Native individual's name, there's honor in that, there's dignity in that. There is no dignity in the team name, in that kind of it. First of all, it opens the door for mockery by the other side, because there's always another side. That's the nature of sports. And the fans of the other team, their job is to mock your symbols, to tear down your mascot. That's why it's a good idea to eliminate all the human beings from this entire enterprise. And that's why most of our educators and um, most of our people who really work with kids a lot, and now most of our kids are saying, get rid of everything, just stop ragging on us.
Yeah, thank you. That you're making such important points. I think it's really many people don't understand. So I've had students when we're looking at these issues in class say, well, I can understand about the R word, but Indians isn't a negative thing, or Chiefs isn't a negative thing. Words that would in other contexts not be offensive, but as a mascot, as a team name, absolutely are. And your history that you just gave of kind of lumping us all under one category in the erasure of different Indian peoples and our unique histories really shows how that evolved, and how what damage that lumping is meant to do when it's thrown then onto a recreational activity or something of that kind. I want to just highlight that Jacob Reed from the chat said that Senator Danielson of Colorado has proposed legislation that would ban Native mascots in Colorado. The hearing is April 1st in the Colorado Senate Education Committee. So just amplifying that news. And then I want to see if Amanda wants to weigh in on this question we're talking about.
Yes, that's great. I'm very happy to see sort of the response after the Washington team name change happened. There's a lot of schools that have come up and have or students and communities all over the country that have come up to say, I'm going to start working on getting my team or my school to change their name. And there was, just a lot of movement happening, and that momentum, I think, I'm seeing now, I'm hearing now, that's still happening at the state level as well. I think that with the schools, especially on the res, I'm in Arizona, yes, there are, schools on the res who still have these names, and they're very hard to get to, very difficult to get to. Because, and I've tried to get to the Red Mesa school. It's been, difficult because the Washington team has really made their presence known there. They're one of the schools that they use in their campaign to buy Native support, have given them money. And as a result, a lot of the families there and a lot of people there are very much pro R word. And I can see that because I grew up on the Navajo Nation. I didn't know about this issue until I left. And it was one of those, like I said earlier, one of the issues where you kind of have to see it to really understand it. And I think living on the reservation, you can live there and really not need to go anywhere off the res for long periods of time. So, you experience racism in the border towns, but you don't really see it. I mean, but you don't really make the connection between that and sports teams and how that is offensive to Native people. And so that background that Suzanne's talking about, I think that's the education that people need. And they need to understand this goes far beyond just your time in your elementary and high school years. This goes way back into the history of Native people and the boarding school era. A lot of these names came about at the same time, when assimilation was at its finest, and Native people weren't concerned about sports teams at that time. They were concerned about keeping their families together and keeping their children safe, and the survival and safety of just trying to live. And so, it's been ingrained in our culture for so long that we don't really think about it, and we forget to look at these things and say, where did this come from? And so if anyone out there knows of any connections or anything in the Red Mesa area or the St. John's area here in Arizona, please let me know, message me. And I've tried to reach out to them numerous times, and they just don't respond. So.
Thanks, Amanda. And you raised this question of really asking ourselves, where did these things come from? And we have gotten a couple questions in the chat about why the R word is offensive. So I'm wondering if you all could maybe speak a bit about the root of the word, its history, and why it is so offensive.
Well, it's offensive because it stands for the skinning of Native peoples. In other words, the killing of Native peoples, the murder of Native peoples. And there were actual bounty proclamations put out by companies first, and then colonies, and then states and local governments well into and through the 1800s and even into the 1900s, early 1900s, where people were offered money to kill Indians and bring as proof of Indian kill, is usually the way it was phrased, the red skin, or sometimes it was called genteelly the scalp, which could mean the scalp of the head, the scalp of the genitalia. Whether or not it would be the genitalia depended on whether the bounty proclamation was specific and paid more for a man than it did for a woman, and more for a woman than it did for a child. And if it was, if the bounty proclamation was gender or age specific, then that is adult child or man woman or boy girl, then you had to bring in the genitalia, how either that or the whole body, the whole dead body. That would be the proof of Indian killed. And you see that and it's called trophy making, trophy gathering, trophy collecting, when it's not bounty proof of Indian kill, in that after each what people call battles, like the Battle of Sand Creek, which was a massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children, mainly old men, old chiefs, nursing mothers, young mothers, and children in a peace camp. And they were massacred and then mutilated, and trophies were gathered, fetuses and body parts and the like. This is a grisly, grisly history. And this is not unique to the Cheyennes. It's not unique to the Arapahoes. Navajos have their long walks and massacres, and every nation in the country has this kind of history where something has been done. When we first held meetings in the late 1960s, in 1967, around Indian country, on that really ended up leading to what now is the National Museum of the American Indian and repatriation law and sacred places protection and the like. We found that every place we first went to Zuni, to Santo Domingo, to other pueblos, and into from New Mexico to Arizona, and then up California to Oregon and Washington State, and just telling them what we had done when we put together a coalition toward these things that we saw as emergency needs. In 1967 at Bear Butte in South Dakota, we were kind of comparing notes, saying, this is what we've done. This is why we have done it. Our people have been troubled by visions and dreams about our ancestors who were kept as prisoners of war in our museums and in the museums and collections of the United States and its citizenry. And what we would hear is about the beheadings. Well, everyone had a specific history of a person or persons who had been beheaded or their heads had mysteriously disappeared after they had been buried. And no one knew why. And people were asking, have you found out why they were chopping our heads off? Because that wasn't in our history. That wasn't, at least in North America that I know of, it was not in any of our nation's history to do that. That was not something we experienced until the Europeans came here. And then it was experienced. And it took us a long time to find that the evidence of those things. And then finally we found that it was in part an official program of the United States called the Indian Crania Study of the US Army Surgeon General, and that there were practices that the Army Surgeon General and the Secretary of the Smithsonian Museum, as it was at that time, would advertise in newspapers, the Rocky Mountain News, for one, asking people to go out and harvest Indian skulls and to dig up graves and send us the bones and the grave goods, they would say so disrespectfully, as if it were just pirate treasure. These were things that were going on, and the trophies were either about, they were either the evidence or of Indian killed in order to be paid, or they were the evidence of Indians who were killed in order for you to be honored, you, the killer, to be honored. Now that's an extraordinary thing, but that is what the R word harkens back to. And that's a sorry set of chapters in American history that we don't want to return to. And we know how easy it is and how quickly it can happen, where you have a disintegration of a civilization into uncivilized behavior. And we don't want to see that again. And we want to eliminate all the vestiges of that and glorification of that kind of savagery that was inflicted on our peoples, our civilized peoples. So that's, for me, what's behind the R word. And we had to do a lot of research in order to prove that to people. They didn't know that, what do you mean bounties? And well, here's the bounty proclamation. Well, then what do you mean this? And what do you mean that? Well, eventually we ended up finding US Army officer reports of how they dug up bodies and beheaded people. And I waited until cover of darkness till the grieving family left the gravesite, exhumed the body, decapitated it. It is contained forth and sent to you forthwith. So those kinds of letters and reports from the field about Indian people's heads, dead and alive, and the callousness of it all, that people thought it was being done for science. It was being done in the name of science. That was the most modern scientific thing of the moment. So this is the kind of thing that we have lived through. Our grandparents were born into. Our great-grandparents lived through it, and many of them did not survive it. So this is not ancient history for us. This is family history. This is close-up history. And anytime we hear that word, it doesn't mean anything good.
That was a great explanation, Suzanne. And Amanda, if you want to speak to that question, we'd love to hear from you, but I also want to ask you, I think it was in, while we're on this question of the use of the R word, I think it was in a Democracy Now! Interview with you that, that I saw where you were talking about how in the context of the name change in 2020, which was covered amply in the press, it was frustrating to see that all these media outlets, all these journalists using the word as they were reporting on it, right? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can shift that in the future so that future reporting, they kind of understand that every use of the word that we have to hear causes harm, right? That it's offensive and harmful, and they need to modify their public use of it.
Yeah, I think that has been the biggest struggle throughout these years in trying to get people to understand that part, especially the media. And you literally will tell the media, stop saying the word because it's offensive. And they're like, well, that's the name of the team. And, we have to use it. And so many media outlets have told me that. Some of them have listened and some of them have said, okay, we're not going to say it anymore. But it's been very few that have said, I'll respect your wishes. But I think it's just, I don't think that sometimes people really, when you try to share the history with them, a lot of the times, they're like, oh, well, that's something that happened back then, something that happened a long time ago. We don't know, it's like they try to make you seem like you're just making these things up and going along and just, making empty claims or whatnot. And that has always been, I think, the struggle throughout the years. And when you really think about it, I mean, it's a really gruesome history. It's very, this really happened to our ancestors, and just recently, and when I'm out here in Arizona in the Southwest, and people say, oh, well, that stuff happened over there, somewhere else in a different part of this country, and it's like, no, it was happening here too. There were literally bounty newspaper clippings that have, the government was trying to pay people to go out and kill Native people at $250 a person, which back then that was a lot of money, and people could become very wealthy off of human bounty hunting. And so, yeah, I think that's always been a struggle, and I think we have to keep reminding people, and sometimes it can be really tiring having to continue to remind people, but we just have to keep doing it. But yeah, definitely, I think with the media that have listened to Native people, I think that's great, but there's just too many out there who just don't listen to us.
That's unfortunate. Here's another question from the audience, from Joshua Hunt. He says, what advice do you have for young Indigenous activists who are trying to eliminate Native American mascots from public schools?
I'm going to let the young, beautiful Amanda Blackhorse with her beautiful, beautiful boy. And thanks for sharing him with us, Amanda. He's just lovely. And the two of you make a wonderful picture. Why don't you answer that and ask people to do what you want them to do?
Yes. So thank you very much, Suzanne. He's my little man. So I would just say that, you know, no matter what people tell you, no matter how much they say it can't happen, it's not going to happen, that's been the name of the school or whatever for however many years, you know, some of these go back like, you know, the 30s and even before that, you know, like they go back so far. Don't listen to that, you know, don't listen to that. You have to keep going. You have to keep putting pressure. And sometimes it feels like you're saying the same thing over and doing the same thing over, and it can be exhausting, you know, especially when you don't have a lot of resources at hand, and, you know, you have to find support wherever you can. Always lean on Indigenous people who are in your territory. So, and sometimes that's hard too, because you might be in an area where there aren't a lot of, where there are Native people who actually support the name. So that can be hard too. But, you know, always, you know, understand that there's always going to be obstacles, but you have to work through it. And that, there are other people out there who are doing the same thing. There is a support system out there. There are, you know, other schools other students who are going through a lot of these changes. There are a lot of mothers out there who have helped who have advocated as well. There's a whole network out there. If you go onto our webpage, www.nomorenativemascots.org, there, and click on Take Action. There's some petitions on there that you can sign, and you can see other schools and other people who are taking up a fight in their own community. And those people can be a really, really great resource as well. So, you know, reach out to people. And a lot of the people who have sent me those petitions are really just needing support too. Like they're needing, like, is what I'm doing okay? Is this the right thing is this the right path? And so a lot of people kind of second guess themselves, but it's like, just do it, you know? Now is the time. Use that momentum, you know, from, you know, the Washington name change, the Cleveland team, you know, talking about changing their name. Use that momentum. And I wish that I could be more on the ground and more hands-on with people, and helping through this process, but it's just really hard for me because, you know, I have my little guy here. I have a career, you know, I can't have my hands in all of it. I really wish I could, but I can't. So definitely look for that support system. And it doesn't also, I just learned recently too, that it doesn't also pertain to Native mascots. There's a school in Anaheim, they're called the Colonists. I mean, they're literally called the Colonists. And I think their logo is actually of a colonist. And they're working in that community with the help of the Tongva leaders to get that name change as well. They're getting a lot of backlash too from the community and people who say, you know, it's been this way for a very long time, yada yada yada. But they're moving forward. You know, they're doing it. So it is possible. And Suzanne said, you know, there's so many schools that have dropped their names. So it is completely possible, and don't be discouraged. I actually never thought that I would ever see the Washington name change. Actually, I was like, it's not going to happen until, you know, maybe when, you know, there's this generation right here might be the ones to do it. But it happened a lot sooner, and so it is completely possible.
Thanks, Amanda. There's just a kind of a related question I'm looking for in the chat because I lost it, from Fawn Douglas, who is asking about how do we build a sense of pride in natives, among natives, right? That isn't a reflection of the mascot. Like, what role does that kind of, building a sense of pride in being native play in the struggle to get rid of?
I think that already exists around teams, but we have to cut each other a lot of slack, I think. While we have to lift each other up in a way that we've been told for generations not to. Keep in mind that food has been used as a weapon in Indian country since colonization. And part of subjugation is making people dependent on you on a foreign power for their livelihood, for their food. And that's how everyone laughs about the term hang around the fort Indians. I mean, what that means is they were lining up to get rations because the white people were killing the buffalo in the plains, on the plains. And why? Because General Philip Sheridan had said, kill the Indian's commissary and you kill the Indian. So it gave permission to the white buffalo hunters to go out and kill what turned out to be over 50 million buffalo, almost drove them to extinction. And yet they're here. So we're sort of like that. We're the buffalo, and we're still here, which is pretty remarkable sometimes to ourselves, but we have some old habits, which are kind of starvation era habits, where we think we have to compete with each other or to undermine each other in order to come out on top and have food for your family to live that week. So there's that going on. There's still the subjugation from outside. Um, there is still there are still non-native people who want to exploit native people by using some native people against those who say no exploitation is going to happen on my watch. And we're not a monolith. We're so many distinct nations, nearly 600, and we, even though, and there is a constant repetition of bad facts. There is anytime you hear non-native people or native people say, well, most native people aren't bothered by the mascots. That's hogwash. That is absolute hogwash. And it's made up by first the Annenberg Foundation study, which wasn't a study at all. It was a question popped into the middle of a survey about demographics generally for voting purposes. And it was basically, do you want to see an end to the R word team, or doesn't it bother you? Well, first of all, that's an asymmetrical question, and that's not how you do surveys. So it should have been debunked and eliminated from the survey canon right then. But it continued and took on a life of its own until the Washington Post revived it by saying the same thing, asking the same two dumb questions, and doing some cold calling and saying, are you Native American? Well, yes. Well, statistically, that would not happen very many times, that when you do cold calling, you get a Native person on the phone because we're such a minuscule portion of the overall population of America that we barely register on the population scale. So that shouldn't have happened, and yet it did. And then they just accept yes or no without asking the follow-up questions. What nation are you? What tribe are you? What pueblo are you? I mean, you have to ascertain if the person is Native, if you're going to draw any conclusions between Native people and non-Native people, or Native people who like this name and people who don't. Anyway, both the Annenberg and the Washington Post survey, no surprise, came out the same way, that most of us say, fine, we're not bothered by it. Well, that's not even true. And those surveys that have been done by people who know what they're doing in Indian country, and when people who are asked whether they're Indian or not, they are among the population that is generally aware of Native issues and has some working knowledge of the people. Then it's completely reversed. And almost everyone wants these names done away with. And that's what every single major national organization that we have, and we have a whole lot of them, has said for a very long time, that they want an end to um, all of these names. Just take the Native peoples out of the sports mascot equation. That's all. It's a pretty simple request.
Yes, it is. And that's, I think, a perfect way to wrap up. We are at exactly at 4:30. So Amanda Blackhorse, Suzan Shown Harjo, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an honor to be with you. What a terrific event. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all who attended. Big round of applause for us.
Thanks to the center. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Suzanne and Amanda and Shannon. It was a wonderful conversation. In closing, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy these cultural Zoom events offered by the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. We have quite a few events coming in April, and we hope you'll also attend. Follow us on our social media pages. In the weeks to come, we will share our upcoming events. If you wish to help us continue our work, please consider donating by visiting our webpage at aisc.ucla.edu. And thank you once again, and happy Women's Month. And you guys are amazing women, so thank you again.
You too. Back at you. Thank you.
Bye.